Today's Bible study is on Psalm 104, beginning at verse 24. Please read through the passage in the Bible before you watch this video. This reading is set for Pentecost Sunday, the day when we celebrate God's gift of the Spirit who gives life to a defeated church. This psalm is perhaps quite mind-blowing as it pushes the boundaries of Pentecost that we may have set into much larger areas of faith and reality. God's gift of the Spirit is not just for the community of faith, but it's also for the life and well-being of the whole of creation. Just as the church only lives because of the gift of God's Spirit, so creation also only lives because of the gift of God's Spirit. Verses 24 to 26 state that the world belongs entirely to God. If you read from the very beginning of the psalm, you will see that we have here a wonderful poem that's almost like an inventory of creation. Each part of creation is named as being a product of God's unique decision and power and love and creativity. It's a beautiful poem expressing love in every detail. God's love, and clearly also the poet's love for everything that God has created. Now, in verse 24, the psalmist begins to reach a conclusion from all that has gone before. The psalmist is amazed and delighted and can't help but express all this to God. How many are your creatures? It's almost as though he's saying, we didn't know there were so many creatures until we made a comprehensive list, and it's amazing. The psalmist pays special attention to the seas and sea creatures. And anyone who ever watched Blue Planet will understand why. And ships and even Leviathan the sea monster are singled out for a mention. In the poetic life of ancient Israel, the sea is dangerous. It's ominous and foreboding, always threatening chaos, and sometimes even embodying evil. But this psalm makes a huge and daring claim that all this frightening and overwhelming stuff is no bother to God. Even Leviathan is like a pet to God. One writer said that Leviathan is like God's rubber duck. God rules the sea completely, and the threat of chaos that comes from it is eliminated. The whole of creation, even the scary and unknowable stuff, belongs to God and is glad to do so. Verses 27 to 30 show the gladness of this dependence on God. Creation acknowledges that it is a good and joyful thing to know that we depend on God's life-giving power. These verses form a confession of dependence on God that's rooted in the most essential thing, eating. All creatures live by God's provision of daily bread. No creature has private resources for life, and no one, not even human beings, can store up power for life itself. The power required to live must be regularly and faithfully given through God's generosity. And just as importantly, it needs to be regularly received with gratitude. The image then quickly moves from food to life-giving presence in verses 29 to 30. The idea is perhaps that the point has been made with food. People understand about the necessity of food for life. So then the psalmist moves on and draws a comparison. Just as you know how essential it is to have food in order to live, it's just as essential to have the presence of God. This is set out as negative in verse 29 and then as a positive in verse 30. And you might notice the symmetry of the key words in these two verses. Face, spirit, breath, spirit, face. The first part of each of these describes God's life-giving presence, and the second part describes our capacity to live. The words face and spirit roughly mean the same thing here, both refer to God's life-giving presence. The negative statement is that the absence of God's face carries a loss of human spirit leading to death. The positive affirmation is that God's Spirit causes renewal on the face of the earth. It's personal and it's elemental. God's presence lets life live. God's absence causes life to end. This is a massive theological claim. The world is not autonomous and creation doesn't start itself off. It always depends on God's love and attention and self-giving. This psalm perhaps shows us that Pentecost is written in the cosmos. The world depends on God's breath and God's food in order to live. This is a challenge to us today in a world where we think we're autonomous, or if we're not, then that's what we want to be, and where the attractions of technology help us to imagine that we can have life completely on our own terms. Just as the church cannot have a life on its own without any reference to God's Spirit, it's also impossible for the world to be self-sufficient. Global heating, the devastation of the rainforests, death by agricultural chemicals, pollution and poverty surely show us that the world cannot be made self-sufficient by our desires, ideology or technology. We may be technologically self-confident, but this psalm invites us to acknowledge instead a theological realism about our world and about the ways in which we all have life, thanks only to our Creator's love and generosity. The psalm ends in joyfulness, giving praise to God. In the light of all that has been affirmed about God's life-giving goodness, what else can we do but praise? The word blessing refers both to a gift that is given and to an act of praise and thanksgiving. So when we're invited to join the psalmist in blessing the Lord in verse 35, we're being called to offer our own thankfulness as a response to all that we have received from God. Verses 31 to 34 are a prayer that God will continue to find delight in God's creation. Because if God stops delighting in it, in us, then the earth will die. The earth is as dependent on God as is a young child on its parents. God only needs to look and the earth trembles, and God only needs the slightest touch and the earth smokes. Verse 32. God is the giver of life. The only adequate response to God's gracious and life-giving goodness is set out for us in verses 33 to 34 and 35b. To sing praise, to meditate, and to rejoice. If you would like to think about this further, there are some questions that you might want to consider. Read through the whole of this psalm slowly. Enjoy the poetry and imagery of it. Try to picture the different scenes that the psalmist describes. Are there any parts of this psalm that you feel particularly drawn to? What images stand out for you? In a world where autonomy is something to be desired, how do you respond to the idea of dependence that this psalm demonstrates? Where in your life are you most strongly aware of your dependence on God? Where are you most strongly self-sufficient? Are there things in life that you find hard to relinquish to God? How do you respond to the idea that God delights in creation? How do you respond to the idea expressed by the psalmist that if God for any reason stops delighting in us and the rest of creation, then we will die? Think of any situations in your life or in the wider world that may not be causes of delight for God. Offer those things to God and ask that God will bring about transformation. Spend some time thinking about your daily living and acknowledge your dependence on other people. Then beyond that, acknowledge your dependence on God. Spend some time in thankfulness and praise as you think about all the blessings you receive from God day by day.